Hello and welcome to episode 62 of Linux After Dark. I'm Joe.
I'm Chris.
I'm Gary.
And I'm Dalton.
Welcome back, chaps. Today, I want to talk about FOSS Extremes. The best open source software, the most exciting, the most dependable, the somethingest bit of open source software. So you've got to come up with an extreme adjective and then the bit of software that you think it is. So for example, I think the cleverest bit of open source software has to be cryptography and encryption. Everyone involved with that is an absolute genius as far as I'm concerned. I know a lot of clever people in the open source world, but none of you lot could do not even you, Dalton, could do the cryptography stuff, right?
Watch me. No, you're right.
Yeah, it is incredible. If you go to Bletchley Park and you look through the history of things and how it's developed, it's a very interesting way of looking at the world and intersecting with computer science. For me, the cleverest one, I think, is protondxvk and all of the pipelines that go into that. Glorious Eggroll, also called Thomas, gave a talk at the Ubuntu Summit about how it all plugs together. And it was quite technical, but he maps out, and I think it's on YouTube now, he maps out how everything interfaces and translates all the calls. And it's so integral to the way the Steam Deck has been a real success, all of this stuff. And I just think it's really, really impressive that you can translate all of those things. And obviously it's got its lineage with wine and everything. But for me, especially when he broke it down in that talk, because I always was sort of like, it just kind of works, doesn't it? There's a Proton DB. Does this game have gold, silver, platinum or whatever? I never really thought, how is that actually happening? So that was a really enlightening talk to see how it's plugged together.
I do fully agree that all of these things are clever. But you know what's cleverer? Networking. Do not ever look into what a networking stack looks like, whether it's on a switch, switching frames at layer 2 on Ethernet, or a router routing packets on layer 3. Just do not look into that aperture. It's scary. I don't even know how I explain how terrifying this code is.
I think for me, it's anything that's doing like direct system call translation on the fly, like in the way that WSLv1 did and in the way that Wine does. So I guess it's a little bit similar to yours, Chris. But the fact that I can in real time translate Windows system calls to Linux system calls or vice versa is just feels like voodoo to me.
And the fact they got rid of it shows that it was a terrible idea.
I'm sure it was a terrible idea, but like the fact that that works in real time as well as it did or does is just amazing to me.
I think good idea, just impractical to maintain. That's probably a better way to put it.
Yeah, exactly. I think it would probably work if all of the Win32 API calls stayed as they were 25 years ago, but developers going to develop.
Linked is the most dangerous and problematic for me, which is alsa mixer. I never thought something like that could be so dangerous when I loaded it and saw, oh, it's a TUI, it's got some colored bars, there's sound interfaces. I'll just go through pressing the spacebar, flipping devices on and off as I go through the mixer. What could go wrong? Can someone smell that? What's that? Why is that? Is that blue? Is that blue smoke? And I completely blew the speakers. And obviously, if you go back far enough, you could destroy your monitor with low-level tools. And I guess as part of a whole sort of program of things, there's lots of hardware fail-safes in there. But this wasn't that long ago. The fact that I can still load what seems like a really innocuous command line tool and just fry my hardware, for me, it feels dangerous. And that's why with the Asahi stuff recently, where they're developing that stack, and I've been reading the development, I don't have a MacBook to try it out, but I can see why there's so many admonitions in the GitHub repo. Like, if you get this wrong, you will break things.
Yeah.
That's still very much a thing on ARM platforms. For example, when we were early in the development of the PinePhone Pro, and I didn't see that project through to completion at all, but early in its development, there were rumblings about, okay, the rock chip we're putting in this thing, if we run it at full bore all the time, will melt the PinePhone.
which happens to have a lithium battery in it, so that'll be fine.
Maybe it wouldn't actually melt, but it'd get warm, so maybe it would. So what are we going to do? How are we going to prevent this thing from using too much power? And there were a lot of ideas, including hardware ideas, like we need to put a failsafe on the board, whether it's a thermal fuse or just a resistor that prevents it from drawing too much power so it'll just crash if it tries to go too fast. So many things that were in consideration of how are we going to solve this problem. I think in the end, I don't have all the details, so don't at me. They didn't go with that. It doesn't automatically crash if you use too much power, but they do have a highly binned version of the rock chip that uses less power, something like that, so it's less of a problem, but it's still entirely possible on devices like the Pine phone and the Pine book to just tell the CPU, hey, go way too fast and let's see what happens. I don't recommend it, though.
I fancy some bacon for breakfast. Just pump that up and chuck a couple of rashes on the CPU.
Well, you joke, but there were videos years ago of people frying bacon on like the early Athlon CPUs. So it's possible.
And now that I think about it, that did happen when I built my new Intel PC as well. So it's not like you just completely are safe on newer platforms. Because in the UEFI firmware of my new computer, it was set to use 250 watts sustained. Because it was defaulted to, I have a really good cooler. And I didn't. I had the Intel box cooler on it that can dissipate like 65 watts on a good day. It ran the CPU so hard that it undervolted the motherboard and got very upset.
What about the most dependable over a long time? I've got two examples of this. On the desktop, VLC. And I've had a kind of on and off love-hate relationship with VLC, but of all the video players I've used and audio players and media players generally, I always go back to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on my list as well, along with Kodi. Those are the two things where they're like the Swiss Army knife of media playback that haven't enshittified, at least yet.
Yet, yeah.
VLC, I swear, they've had opportunities to monetize and enshittify. Same with Kodi, or Kodi could have got lost to the moral panic over the plugins and illegal content. But there it is. It's just had a point release. It's still FOSS. It still works. It still plays everything. There's a hell of a lot of development that goes into it. And those two, if I'm playing a video, I know one of the two of them, even if the machine is a bit shit, will find a way to play it as long as it's not too high bitrate for the hardware.
I think I'm going to hit you with something unexpected here. Nextcloud.
No, I think I agree.
Okay, then.
I don't know how long you all have had Nextcloud servers running for, but mine's been running for quite a few years through multiple Ubuntu upgrades, and of course it needs a little bit of tweaking. I don't have it in a container or anything, so I have to, update the path to PHP when I upgrade Ubuntu and stuff like that. But it's just continued running. I've done all the suggestions when it suggests that I do something for improved security or whatever it may be. I've had a Nextcloud instance for multiple years, and it's been reliable.
Yeah, so have I. I think I've had mine running for 6 or 7 years now. And it's the same install, and yeah, it just keeps going. Occasionally I go and disable a load of the apps and stuff, and I'm sure there's a bunch of cruft in there and a load of optimizations that I should do to the DB, but I can pretty safely upgrade it or upgrade the machine that it's on, and it does just work.
You see, for me, it's related Apache. That has just worked for me since I first got into any sort of servers. And I know people say use Nginx because it can do this, that, and the other, and it's better in this way, but I've stuck with Apache and it has been rock solid for me. Apart from the time when I upgraded my Ubuntu version, it got ripped out. But that wasn't Apache's fault, that was Ubuntu's fault.
That almost feels like a cheat.
How is that a cheat?
I don't know why. It just feels like you say Apache is the most reliable open source software, and someone goes, yeah, and?
Yeah, exactly. But I think we need to acknowledge that.
If it doesn't go away, even in the face of the new hotness, which is not so new anymore in Nginx, I think it's a valid point.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of stuff that sits kind of in that area that is really reliable, and you can just leave it and know that it will run. The ones that spring to mind for me are HA Proxy and Redis. And I had a previous employer that had a really ancient Redis server that actually was a VM someone had built in Microsoft Virtual PC running Debian on their PC. And then it had been migrated across about 4 different Hyper-V clusters and was still the same install of Debian running Redis. We just cloned between environments because no one knew what had been done or how this VM had been set up. And it just continued to work. And similarly with HA Proxy, there was a set of HA Proxy servers with Keep Alive D between them to do the active passive stuff. And they just sort of sat and run, and we did an apt upgrade occasionally and update the config file when we needed to, but they just worked.
Doesn't Redis save to one file? Like the complexity of SQLite kind of thing?
I'm sure it does, but at that point, no one in the company was at all interested in Linux, and they wouldn't let me touch it. So it just sat there and ran. It was great.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Kolide. When you go through airport security, there's one line where the TSA agent checks your ID and another where a machine scans your bag. The same thing happens in enterprise security, but instead of passengers and luggage, it's end users and their devices. These days, most companies are pretty good at the first part of the equation, where they check user identity. But user devices can roll right through authentication without getting inspected at all. In fact, a huge percentage of companies allow unmanaged, untrusted devices to access their data. That means an employee can log in from a laptop that has its firewall turned off and hasn't been updated in 6 months. Or worse, that laptop might belong to a bad actor using employee credentials. Kolide finally solves the device trust problem. Kolide ensures that no device can log into your Okta-protected apps unless it passes your security checks. Plus, you can use Kolide on devices without MDM, like your Linux fleet, contractor devices, and every BYOD phone and laptop in your company. So support the show and go to kolide.com/LinuxAfterDark to watch a demo and see how it works. That's KOLIDE.com/LinuxAfterDark. Quick bit of admin then. First of all, thank you everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to linuxafterdark.net/support. And for either $5 or $10 a month on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can email show@linuxafterdark.net. I've thought of something that is even more reliable than Apache. LS, CD, they're open source software. I've never had a problem with those.
Basically core utils, you mean?
Yes, yeah, that's what I was going to say. That was going to be for dullest. They're just there, aren't they?
They are dull, but dull is good.
Yes.
I am so sorry. I found a bug in GNU copy. It was very exciting for a short period of time.
Dullest is a positive, right? I recently switched to Debian XFCE. It's the slowest moving, dullest operating system I've ever used in my life. There's barely ever any apt updates. Nothing is going to change for ages, and I absolutely love it.
Yeah. Ubuntu for me is that same thing. It's dull, but it's also great and reliable.
Audacity is probably a bit like that as well. I mean, I know there was some drama a couple of years ago when they got bought and stuff, but it's basically been the same for 20 years and it just works, and we use it multiple times a week to record these shows.
Yeah, although the newer versions are relatively exciting in that they've got proper inline effects now rather than having to render the effects. I can't remember the term for it now. I should know this, shouldn't I, being an audio person, but proper inserts rather than just offline effects. And that's apparently a big deal, but I've not got that version in my Ubuntu LTS yet, so I've not checked it out.
There's a divide, isn't there? Me and Joe are on version 2. I think Dalton and Gary are on version 3, right?
Yep, I am.
Yeah, because we were running real operating systems.
Don't out me like that.
Well, speaking of Gary's Mac, I think one of the exciting things is Asahi. And I know we get a lot of shit for this because why buy a Mac when you could just buy whatever, battery life, performance, cooling, all the rest of it. I don't care. They're great machines. I don't like macOS. Asahi is exciting and cool and excellent.
Yeah, I have to agree. I've been using the Fedora Asahi remix or whatever it is. Is it a remix now or is it official?
I think it's official now.
Yeah, I've been using that quite a lot on my M2 Air, particularly when they gave us the Christmas gift of sound.
Yeah.
And it's great. I can't complain about it at all. I just really want the last couple of things that don't quite work yet to start working.
Yeah, video out and stuff would be great.
Yeah, video out would mean I could daily drive it, and the webcam would be really, really nice as well. But I'm not holding out hope. I think for me, the piece of software I've discovered slightly more recently than Asahi, and we talked about this in our Hopes episode, is Image. Because I've been searching for years for a proper replacement for Google Photos, and I ended up resorting to just having the photos upload to Nextcloud, which was a bit rubbish because I just got an MP4 of like the moving image, whatever that's called, and then I got a JPEG of the best shot. But it was a bit rubbish. The geotagging stuff didn't work. The UI was just, I'm browsing some images in a file browser. But Image is just so close to Google Photos that to the untrained eye, you probably wouldn't notice. And I've recommended it to so many people, and everyone really, really likes it. So it's just a really good piece of software.
The coolest, which I found, this is George Castro's fault. For ages, I wanted to view Markdown files in the terminal. Quite often, especially at work, I'll clone a GitHub repo and I want to look at the README file with a little bit of, Markdown rendering. And there's this thing called Glow, which is part of the Charm bracelet project. The website for Charm is quite funny. It's very colorful, like super neon unicorns and shoes and rainbows and everything. But it's just so cool and handy to have when you clone a repo and you just do glow readme.md and it's colored, it's laid out properly, it has some semblance of the layout, and it is just so much easier to read it because it's just highlighted and it's really easy to scan and get some ideas. And I think it's because I'd been looking for something for ages, and it's that synchronicity of, I keep meaning to look for a tool, but I don't have time. And then someone else lays it at your feet and you're like, oh yeah, there it is.
Well, speaking of George Castro, I've just come up with one. What am I going to call this? I'm going to say the most technically interesting, but not really for me, piece of open source software is the whole immutable distros thing. What George is doing with UBlue and Bazai and all of that stuff, and even SteamOS to some extent, that whole immutable bulletproof Linux, whatever you want to call it, it's not really for me yet, but that is technically probably one of the most interesting bits of open source software, at least on the desktop. Well, let's get into negatives then. The most frustrating open source software has got to be Android for me because it's just so fundamentally shit. It works great most of the time. And then even on a fucking Pixel, it just has weird issues all the time. And I have to close apps and little things like restarting playback of podcasts I do from the drag down thing. And just that works about 20% of the time. And I don't know if that is AntennaPod's fault or Google's.
Thank you. AntennaPod specifically is really guilty of it. I should file a bug. We talked about that many episodes ago.
Yeah.
And I haven't, or at least check if there's an open issue and add my +1 thumbs up to it. But frustrating that is. But also the fact that I'm not running Lineage anymore and that whole thing, I'm annoyed about what it once was and isn't anymore. And that's also because I want to run banking apps and I'm not failing, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. The most dangerous and problematic open source software has got to be cryptocurrencies, as far as I'm concerned. And yes, I know I'm banging on about it again, but, it's all open source, but that doesn't make it good.
He dropped the mic.
I was expecting a longer rant.
No, I'm not going to do a long rant about it. People know about the environmental concerns, about the fact that it's a pyramid scheme, and encouraging people into a pyramid scheme is not a good idea. And, people only do it to prop the whole thing up. You've made me do the rant. Fuck you.
So funniest, and it's because it's in recent ether, and thank you, Popey, for this one, is curling ip.wtf/moo in your terminal will give you, much like any other public IP address curl, but if you just want to check, I have dynamic DNS set up. Sometimes you want to know what your public IP is or check what country it's in, whatever. And yeah, it just pipes out to a cow saying that your fucking IP address is this. And it even has a little flip. So you ask the cow one way and then it flips around and moves out your IP address with an expletive. So
Wait, do you get an explosion when you do that? Because I do.
Oh, well, I have to try. Not that I've noticed before. Does it do a different thing each time?
No, it just flips, but there's a little explosion that appears on my screen.
Oh.
Very strange. Maybe that's a thing that happens on my Unix that doesn't happen on your Unix.
Oh, your Unix, Gary.
Yes.
Well, what about the silliest? I think probably SL might be the silliest. So for those who don't know, if you mistype ls as SL and you've installed SL, you get a steam locomotive that just goes across your terminal to remind you that you have done a typo. But also, I initially thought the silliest has got to be Rebecca Black OS, which I thought surely that must be dead. But no, that is actively developed.
Listen, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm not an expert, maybe someone can chip in, isn't it one of the first places that a working Wayland display server was stood up? Is that right?
I believe so, yeah.
Genuinely, I think it is.
Yeah, it was Rebecca Black OS, and it's still going. And so is it silly? I don't know, maybe not. Maybe it is a bit more serious than you would first think.
I think the best mark of any satire is that it's got a little bit of bite in it, you know?
Yeah.
Do they only release on a Friday? That's what I want to know.
They definitely should do. Or Saturday, her follow-up, which was not quite as successful. Well, do let us know your FOSS extremes. You can email us show@linuxafterdark.net. But we better get out of here. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. But until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Chris.
I've been Gary.
Joplin is my note-takingest app.
See you later.